Hey there. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Ben. I am a longtime follower of Jesus, a studier of the scriptures, and theologian, I guess you could say. And it's something that I've been wanting to do for quite a while, is to make little devotional videos to help people out, just to dig into the scriptures and dig into theology a little bit more. I was praying this morning and I was asking God, what if I did that, what would I do it on? And as I was praying, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are two books in the Bible. They kept coming to mind. And so I was thinking, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, that's wisdom literature. So for those of you that don't know what wisdom literature is, what's often referred to as wisdom literature is Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Now, I love those books, especially when you look at them together. I wanted to start going through those, and I find it a fun thought experiment to go through it in a certain way, to go through Proverbs first, then Ecclesiastes, and then Job. However, I'm really wanting to go through Ecclesiastes right now, because for those of you that don't know, I have cancer and I am going through treatment for cancer. And when Ecclesiastes would normally be kind of discouraging for people, considering that it's all, hey, things don't actually work out the way that you want them to, I find it a little bit encouraging because I'm experiencing that. And so for those of you that are also experiencing the ecclesiastical life, I guess you could say, it is encouraging to see that life is full of bumps and bruises, and it's a crazy up and down journey. But before I start to dig into the scriptures, I wanted to just give a brief overview of wisdom in the scriptures, because I believe that there's all kinds of different themes throughout the scriptures that if we look at, we'll see kind of pop up here and there. And wisdom is an amazing theme that if we take a look all the way from the very beginning in Genesis all the way to the end in Revelation, that what we will see is that wisdom does play a pretty amazing role in the story of in the entire storyline of Scripture. In Proverbs 3:19, it says, "By wisdom God laid the earth's foundations. By understanding He set the heavens in place." We see this divide between the earth and the heavens, which is like the sky, and God's wisdom and understanding being that which placed it there. So by God's wisdom, He actually made creation. So that makes us think, okay, what is wisdom? Because a lot of us think that to be wise means to be like Yoda, to sit there in a chair like some kind of sage and have people come to you and ask you what decision they should make. And for you to say, "Make that decision, you will." We think that that's what wisdom is. But what we see in the scriptures, at least, is knowledge, is understanding, is intellect, is intelligence a part of that? Sure, but wisdom has a lot more to do with what you're able to actually accomplish. And so even just doing a study on what wisdom actually is quite fascinating. Wisdom is where the rubber meets the road. If knowledge is somehow gasoline, fuel to be able to drive your car, because knowledge is important, right? It's not the most important thing. There's plenty of people that worship knowledge that shouldn't. But if knowledge is a sense of fuel, wisdom is the act of the rubber actually meeting the road and the car actually getting somewhere, if that makes sense. So we'll get into more of that, especially as it comes to Proverbs. Proverbs is full of all kinds of great wisdom, and oftentimes people think, man, if this is true, then if I do exactly what it says in Proverbs, then that will be the outcome of my life, right? If you're righteous, then you're going to end up being blessed. Proverbs has a righteous justification element to it, where everything will be justified. The evil, the wicked will be punished, and the righteous will thrive. That is the kind of outlook of Proverbs. And there's tons of wisdom in it. There's tons of promises, but wise promises of wisdom, Proverbs, are almost like promises that are bound to be broken. And so that's what Ecclesiastes is about, is the complete shattering of the status quo, the shattering of those promises that we thought, hey, this shouldn't be, broken promises. It says in the Bible, for crying out loud, that if I do this, then that'll be the result. But in all reality, we've seen righteous people get totally screwed over. We've seen the evil thrive. Just like Jesus says. He says that, it rains and the sun shines on us all. And so there's a certain reality of life that applies, in the midst of all of that. Wisdom doesn't show up for humans until the woman in the Garden of Eden decides that eating from the tree of knowledge would be a wise decision. What that says to me, or what that kind of makes me think of, I guess you should say, is that she saw that it was good for her calling. Because God called Adam and Eve to tend to the garden, to bring order to the Garden of Eden and to, they're made in the image of God. They're called to represent God in that place with each other in partnership to rule over the earth. And there's this sense that if you see something that's good for wisdom, you're going to use it as a resource for yourself so that you could figure out how to make something happen all on your own. That was in the Garden of Eden, but if we fast forward to the founding of Israel as a nation, another huge part in the story of Scripture, where more promises, more blessings, more covenants are given to the people from God. Later on, as the Israelites are going through the wilderness, some people are given wisdom from God to fulfill certain tasks. We find this in the construction of the Tabernacle, which, interestingly enough, is written in 7 sections that mirror the 7 days of creation. From Exodus 25 to 31, we find 7 points at which it mentions God speaking to Moses. These points are strategic dividing points which reflect the days of creation, right? God is speaking to Moses. God spoke the earth into existence. It says, then God said, let there be light, the end of the whatever day. God said, God said, God said. 7 times in Genesis 1, 7 times in Exodus 25 through 31. Of course, after the 6th, the Lord said to Moses, we find that a man, Bezalel, is appointed to be filled with the Spirit of God with wisdom. Not in order to be a sage that people come to for Yoda-like proverbs, but to work with his hands and use his creative ingenuity to create order and beauty. He is also given a helper, a guy named Aholiab, to help him in this endeavor. Even though they are both men, while not being any sort of commentary on marital companionship, it is a commentary on humanity and human wisdom reflecting God's wisdom. It is a commentary on humanity's role in being wise, and in doing so, fulfill their purpose in being made in the image of God. Then, after the 7th, the Lord said to Moses, we are given a reminder from God to Moses to make sure the nation remembers and abides in the day of Sabbath rest. So at this point, we can see that wisdom from God is a good thing. We are called to wisdom, but seeking autonomous wisdom for one's own aims is what gets us in trouble. So another huge point, after the establishing of Israel as a nation, we see this guy come on the scenes, and his name is Solomon. Now here's the interesting thing about Solomon. Real quick, before Solomon, we see David, King David, who's often referred to as a hero in Scripture. A covenant was given to David from God, and in that covenant it says that your descendant will sit on your throne forever. And then if you actually fast forward to Chronicles, it has a way of suggesting in a slightly different way in the original Hebrew that descendant that sits on the throne forever could be descendants, or like an eventual descendant, which is an idea that it's just, hey, your lineage is going to continue on the throne, and eventually there's going to be a guy named Jesus who's going to sit on that throne and fulfill it forever. But in the context of right before Solomon comes on the scene, as you're reading through Scripture, we see him and we think this could be the guy. And what we see with Solomon is that he prays and he asks God for wisdom. Why? So that he can serve the nation well, so that he can actually do what's right by the people of Israel. And that's exactly what happened. God saw his heart. He saw his request for wisdom, for the skill, for the ability to be able to serve, be able to rule as a good king, to do that well. And God granted that. And we see at that point in time, Solomon was a Davidic figure, and he was kind of in a way a messianic figure, until of course when we see that he totally botched everything and messed it all up. But we see an image, we see a glimpse of the completed Israel, of a prosperous Israel. And it is because of the wisdom that God gave him that he was able to accomplish so much, to bring so much prosperity and peace, and have good relations with the other nations, and just to make things run really, really well. So Solomon is the embodiment of wisdom in a messianic figure. Solomon also writes Proverbs, and it is thought often that he wrote Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes. What we find, at the very least, in Ecclesiastes, we see 2 characters. We see the writer and the speaker. And the writer shows up very minimally, and then the speaker shows up as this person who somehow gathers. Are they gathering proverbs, or are they gathering people together to teach them? It's not completely 100% clear, but it's someone who gathers. And at the very least, we could read through Ecclesiastes and think, even if it's not Solomon, it is referencing some kind of Solomonic figure, if that makes sense. It is somebody who is very wise. it says that this person in Ecclesiastes wrote thousands of Proverbs, and I believe it says that somewhere in Kings as well, that Solomon wrote thousands of Proverbs. Solomon writes, he claims that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. So this idea goes straight back to the garden. Seeking wisdom outside of the jurisdiction of God doesn't end up well, which Solomon articulates elaborately also in Ecclesiastes. What he finds is like, hey, as I sought wisdom on my own accord, trying to grab at it, trying to hoard it, trying to take it, it didn't actually end up well. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fast forward even more. Let's take a look at Jesus. Jesus comes on the scenes, and what does he say? He says that someone greater than Solomon was on the scene. And who was he talking about? He was talking about himself. And from an Israelite perspective, from a Hebrew perspective, how could you say that anybody is greater than Solomon, right? I mean, the nation of Israel was so prosperous. Solomon was that messianic image for a time until his true humanity really showed. And then Jesus comes on the scene and he says, I'm greater than him. Jesus is, and I believe this, I believe Jesus is a genius. I believe that Jesus is the wisest man who has ever walked the earth. The New Testament writers have a couple other things to say as well. So one thing I want to mention real quick is in John 1. In the Gospel of John, the Gospel according to John, it talks about the Logos. And the Logos is translated into English as Word. And what we see in John 1, it says, the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was there at the beginning of all creation, and all the stuff that it says in that beautiful prologue in John 1, verses 1 through 14. Go check it out if you haven't read it for a while, because it's absolutely mind-boggling. But here's the interesting thing about the Logos. The Logos was almost a play on two different converging cultures at one point in time. And at the very least, John writing it, John using that imagery, it could have been a convergence between Greek thought and Hebrew thought. Now, according to Hebrew thought, just like we said, God said this, God said that, and when God says things, it makes stuff happen. So that's how powerful and that's how wise God is. So when you mention the word, that's instantly going to be making you think, yes, because God speaks and stuff happens. But then also at the same time, the Logos is looked at from Greek thought, from a Stoic way of thought, from Stoic philosophy, as a ruling principle in the universe. And it's where we get the word logic from. So it's a logic that somehow has helped the universe to maintain order. And according to their way of thought, if you could somehow come into alignment with the Logos, the word, that would make everything else fall into place. It is a wisdom that makes the universe run. And so they actually thought that they could get in line with that. Of course, we know that the wisdom that makes the universe run comes from God, that it isn't the deity itself. It's not an impersonal deity. It's from God that wisdom comes. And wisdom is powerful, albeit comes from God. Another New Testament writer, James, writes quite a bit about wisdom. It is clearly a good thing, according to him, right? Yet dangerous when in conjunction with a heart that is filled with selfish ambition. So this here today was purely just for the purpose of taking a brief snapshot at wisdom, at what wisdom is, which is something I'm totally fascinated about. But what we're going to be doing pressing forward is we're going to be taking the next step. We're going to take an overview of just Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job and how they interact with one another in the next session. And then after that, we're going to dig a little bit deeper and we'll start to get into the actual scriptures and break it down piece by piece. So thank you all for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.